Located on the southeast portion of the Bull Street campus, bordered by Calhoun Street to the south and Barnwell Street to the east, the Parker Annex is the only remaining structure that was built solely for African Americans at the South Carolina State Hospital. Constructed in 1910, the Parker Annex is a two-story, ivory-painted brick building that was used as a dormitory for black males. The building style resembles a typical Southern colonial residence, yet is on a large institutional scale. The annex was part of a larger complex that included the former Parker Building, which was located next to the annex until its demolition in 1980. The Parker Annex has seen neglect and is in poor condition today. Although this building is not of the same monumentality as the more recognizable Mills and Babcock buildings, the Parker Annex holds an important place in the history of the South Carolina State Hospital, because it is the only remaining legacy of the history, treatment, and segregation of African Americans. Although the Parker Building and its annex provided the first permanent accommodations for black patients, the segregation of the Bull Street campus meant that African Americans were often ignored and pushed into the background until they were completely removed from the hospital in 1937 to the new State Park campus outside of Columbia. In 1848, the state hospital passed legislation which allowed for the admission of African Americans. By admitting black patients, the hospital wanted to enhance its image as a place of humanitarian care. In the antebellum years, most of the patients were slaves and hardly any free blacks were admitted. The number of African Americans remained small until the end of the Civil War because most were cared for at home or by their masters. Slave owners did not want to pay for the treatment of their slaves, and the state was reluctant to fund these patients as well. Between their admission in 1848 and the end of the Civil War in 1865, only 40 African Americans total were treated, and no more than 5 African Americans were in the care of the hospital during the Civil War years. Black patients were housed in small brick structures close to the Mills building that were unsanitary and crowded. Many physicians complained that the close proximity of blacks was distracting and therefore inhibited the recovery of whites. Regular attendants refused to care for African Americans, and therefore the hospital had to hire a special attendant just for this purpose. Due to these problems, all of the black male patients were released in 1858, and only a few females remained. In the 19th century, African Americans suffering from insanity were believed to be biologically defective or socially inferior. Some believe that slavery was beneficial because, like an asylum, it provided structured daily activities, rigorous labor, food, and lodging. In 1895, Superintendent Babcock argued that, quote, the lower brain functioning protected African Americans from higher order mental disorders such as melancholia and mania. After emancipation, census reports show an alarming increase in the estimated number of mentally ill African Americans. It was assumed that because blacks were no longer enslaved, they were more susceptible to lunacy. The hospital only fully opened its doors to African Americans after the Civil War, and large number of former slaves began to be admitted, which led to severe overcrowding. During Reconstruction in Columbia, a new South Carolina state constitution was created in 1868. This new constitution affected the hospital because it allowed the governor the power to appoint the hospital's superintendent and board of regents. By 1869, elected African Americans replaced existing board members. Of these new members, 6 were black and 3 were white. The board's new black majority aroused great concern by many. Most whites were afraid that the races would be mixed in their accommodation and that black attendants would begin to care for whites, especially after 2 blacks were chosen to serve as assistant physician and steward. Although the majority of the hospital board was African American in the Reconstruction years following the Civil War, accommodation for patients did not improve due to budget cuts and priority towards the care of whites. There were hardly any additional funds appropriated to facilities for black patients. Therefore, from the start of their admission, these patients lived in accommodations which were inferior to those provided for whites. In the years after the Civil War, the brick structures that African Americans had previously lived in were replaced by cheaper wooden pavilions in order to continue to keep the races separate. A few more pavilions were added due to the growing number of male patients, yet Black females were housed in the dingy, dirty basement of the Mills building. The conditions were deplorable. Many patients fell ill and a substantial number of them died. Multiple annual reports from the hospital condemn the unsafe, crowded conditions, which also posed a severe threat of fire. Overcrowding was prevalent across the campus in the white wards as well. In 1869, it was suggested by Acting Superintendent Parker that a separate brick building should be constructed for Black males instead of housing them in the wooden pavilions, which were designed to be temporary. Yet, due to lack of funds, it was only in 1897 when enough money was available for a new dormitory to be built. This building was known as the Parker Building. It was designed by Superintendent Babcock, and a Black employee named Paige Ellington was hired as the engineer and contractor. Black patients from the hospital were used to dig the foundation of the building, which was designed to hold 300 patients. The three-story brick building featured a castle-like style. The Parker Building's former location was to the southeast of the Babcock Building, in between the present Parker Annex and the laundry. In 1909, a legislative study of the hospital brought to the forefront the issues of overcrowding and unsanitary conditions. It also led to a frenzied attempt to solve, quote, the race problem. This segregation of whites and Blacks on the campus was a reflection of the Jim Crow laws, which were in effect across the entire nation. Although the Parker Building helped to relieve some of the overcrowding of Black males, there was still a lack of adequate housing. To help solve this, the Regents decided to build the Parker Annex in 1910. A large wooden dormitory for Black males had previously stood on the location where the annex was built. The architect of the building is unknown, and it was designed to house 85 patients. $21,000 was allowed as the budget for the annex, and to cut down on costs, convict labor and brick from the existing walls were used in its construction. The Parker Annex was intended only to be a temporary solution to help alleviate overcrowding, for it was planned that all African Americans would be eventually moved away from Columbia to an entire new hospital. As admission rates began to increase, the 3 buildings used for African Americans proved to be inadequate. In 1922 alone, the Parker Building held 81 more patients than it was designed to allow. Dirty and cramped conditions led to rampant disease and high death rates at the hospital. During the early 20th century, disease and death rates were much higher for Black patients. Versus whites, more Blacks suffered from diseases like pellagra and syphilis. The severe lack of room at the hospital led to unsanitary conditions, and most of the Black patients were treated for their illnesses only after sufficient care had been given to whites. African Americans were forced to suffer for longer as hospital staff placed a larger value on the well-being of white patients. In the Parker Building alone, approximately 1/4 of the patients who lived in the building died. The overcrowding of the hospital meant that care was focused solely on being custodial rather than curative. As one aspect of custodial care, daily occupational therapy and recreational activities were used to help keep the health of the patients from deteriorating due to an idle lifestyle. Almost all of the male patients worked in manual labor jobs on the hospital farm or in the kitchens, mostly because the administration believed that African Americans were better suited to this type of work. Most of the females worked in the dining room services. For recreation and social activities, segregated religious services were provided, and Blacks were only allowed to leave the grounds for a yearly visit to the South Carolina Colored State Fair, a separate event held 1 week after the annual state fair. As previously mentioned, the Board of Regents at the hospital wanted to move all Black patients to a new, separate campus outside of downtown Columbia. Back in 1890, the Regents decided that the races should be further segregated by building a separate hospital campus for African Americans. The quest began to find a suitable amount of land on which to build this new campus, but lack of funds put off the purchase for a few more years to come. In 1910, the same year the Parker Annex was built, land was purchased about 7 miles northeast of Columbia. This new campus was known as State Park, and the first buildings for African Americans were completed in 1913, designed by LaFay and LaFay Architects. The State Park campus was the final solution in the segregation of patients. The hospital board was eager to remove all African Americans from Bull Street campus as quickly as possible. In 1937, this goal was achieved when all of the Black patients were transferred to State Park. The campus was later renamed the Crafts-Farrow State Hospital in 1965. The removal of African Americans affected both the Parker Building and Annex on the Bull Street campus. The Parker Building was remodeled as housing for white male patients, and the Parker Annex was used as a recreational workshop for white males, and later into housing. In 1973, the Parker Annex was renovated for white patients for the Step Up program, in which males that were lacking in personal hygiene and social skills could be monitored and prepared for relocation to a nursing or boarding home. Today, the Parker Annex is a symbol of the segregation and inadequate care that patients at the South Carolina State Hospital received. The bare-bones architectural style of the Parker Annex emphasizes the fact that this building was a hasty afterthought, only constructed due to extreme need. Although the building of the 1897 Parker Building and 1910 Parker Annex showed improvements in the accommodation of Black patients, these buildings were not well taken care of while they were being used by African Americans. It was only until after Black patients were moved to the State Park campus that the Parker Building and Annex were remodeled for use by white patients. This neglect of both buildings during African American occupation symbolizes that it is just one example of the second-rate care of Black patients at Bull Street during their time as patients from 1848 to 1937. Thank you.